Hari Om. Anyone there?
Hari
Hello.
Om, Jim. Hi. This is Deepa here. How are you?
Hi, Deepa here.
Can you give me a minute? I'm trying to take care of a few things, but I'll be back here
Do
in a
Do
sec.
you want me to log off?
No, not at all. I have the controls. I've got
Okay.
it. Okay. I'll be back in a minute. I'm just lighting an incense.
No trouble at all.
Okay.
Alexa, play Krishna Das. Gurur Brahma, Gurur Vishnu, Gurur Devo Maheshwaraha, Gurureva Param Brahma, Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Chinmayam Vyapyat Sarvam, Trilokyam Sacharacharam, Tatpadam Darshitam Yena, Tasmai Sri Gurave Namaha. Twameva Mata Chapita, Twameva Bandhuscha Sakha, Twameva Vidya Dravinam, Tvameva sarvam mama deva deva. Tvameva sarvam mama deva deva. Jai Guru. Om Sahana Bhavatu, Sahana Bhunaktu, Sahaviryam Karavavahai, Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. So we've been in chapter 2, and Krishna has said, you grieve for whom you do not grieve, though you speak words of wisdom. The wise grieve neither for the living nor the dead. And then, of course, Arjuna gets a big question mark on his forehead. So Krishna has now broken down what I call spiritual anthropology. We talked about how Krishna will teach from 3 different levels, viewpoints throughout the Gita. You have to understand this by context. Sometimes he speaks from the highest. Whenever Krishna talks about himself, remember he's talking about the self in you and me. Paramatman. Sometimes he'll address the Sukshma Sharira, the subtle body, what we call the transmigrating soul, that which moves from incarnation to incarnation. And then he talks about the physical body. And he ended up last time where we talked about the physical body finally. Well, every body is born and it dies. Certain is death for the born, and certain is birth for the dead. Why grieve over the inevitable? We're all going to die. So, Deepa, are you our chanter tonight, I hope?
Yes.
All right, and what verse are we on?
So I know I've bookmarked 31, but I have no recollection about whether we did it or not.
32. I think we're on 32.
32? Yeah, okay, so we've done 31. Okay. So 32 is Yadrichaya Chopapannam Swargadwaramapavritam Sukhinah Kshatriya Partha Labhante Yuddhamidrisham. Happy indeed are the Kshatriyas, O Partha, who are called to fight in such a battle that comes of itself as an open door to heaven.
Now, what he's again indicating, we talked about at the beginning of the 2nd chapter. I call it in some ways the table of contents chapter, or you might say the index. So every major spiritual idea that our poet Vyasa is going to cover, he sets forth in brief in the 2nd chapter. So we've left this idea of spiritual anthropology, and we're sneaking our way into karma yoga. Now, let's talk a little bit about karma. Karma, we hear oftentimes in pop culture, good karma, bad karma. Actually, the scriptures don't talk about it in that sense at all. Karma simply means work. The dharma of the human body is karma. Everybody has karma. Everybody has to work. A body without karma is called a corpse. From the day that you're born to the day that you die, your body engages in action in karma. The law of karma is like when you drop a pebble into a pond of water and the ripples go out, they hit the shore, and then the ripples come back. So the energy that we send out gross, meaning the actions we perform, but also subtle. Our mental actions, our sankalpa, goes out into the universe and comes back in kind. That's the law of karma. It's not about good and bad. It just is. Just is. And it's a law like gravity. Gravity doesn't care if you're a good person or a bad person. If there's an airliner and the engines fail, the good people and the bad people both get killed when the plane crashes. Why? Gravity doesn't care. It's its nature to make the plane drop, you see. So whatever we put out comes back in kind. So a yogi, first of all, starts to live a life understanding this. So it's not a moral issue. The moralists would say, oh, it's a sin to cheat. It's a sin to lie. It's a sin to steal. The yogi says, let's take morality out of it. If you cheat, you will be cheated. If you lie, you will be lied to. If you steal, you will be stolen from. Now, it's that simple. There's a time lag, though. Sometimes it can take minutes, hours, years, or lifetimes for the karma to come back. You can run, but you cannot hide. It always returns. So that's the law of karma. Any questions about this before we go on? Now, how do we use our action in a way that's conducive to self-realization? In order to understand this, we have to understand what a vasana is. Vasana comes from the root vasvasati, which means to dwell overnight or to linger. One of the best examples is suppose a woman is in a room and she has a lovely perfume that's unique to her. You know, oh, that's always, we'll just use Deepa as an example. This is the perfume Deepa always wears. And she leaves and the fragrance remains behind. And someone comes in, they go, oh, I love that beautiful fragrance. Deepa must have been here. See, it lingers, it dwells, it remains. So a vasana is an impression. It's a subset of sanskara. Sanskara is an impression. So for example, if you look at this, you can see it's a glass. How do you know it's a glass and not an elephant? You were taught that it's a glass. That's an impression. Sanskaras in and of themselves are not problematic. We couldn't function in the world without them. But a subset of sanskara is vasana. A vasana is an impression left in the unconscious as the result of a previously performed egoistic action. meaning it has I-ness and minus wrapped up with it, and I attribute to the person, place, thing, or situation involved pleasure-giving or misery-producing qualities. That impression then sinks into the unconscious, and in the future, it's what impels me to want to repeat the action. So what we're looking at is, why do I want what I want? Why do I desire to do this and not that, when somebody else desires to do that and not this? The answer is vasana. The answer is karma. It's the impressions left in my mind because of previously performed actions, specifically actions that have I-ness and minus involved. This is my object, it belongs to me, or I have done that particular action. And then after the fact, in a process called chintya. Chintya in Hindi means worry, but in Sanskrit, it just means an after the fact rumination over something. After the fact, I go, oh, that was really marvelous. I really want to do that again. Or, oh, that was horrible. I'll never do that again. And that impression is left in the mind and becomes the cause of future activity. So over lifetimes, we have millions of vasanas. And the thing that's so crazy is they don't always run in the same direction. So for example, I may have the desire to lose weight. And I also have the desire for chocolate ice cream. Guess what? They are contradictory. Which one's going to be the strongest? I may have the desire to be acknowledged at my job for the work that I do. But I may also have the desire not to be the focus of attention. They're in conflict. So this explains the human condition, and why we do what we do. So in the science of karma yoga, Vyasa, drawing on the tradition, lays out in chapters 3, 4, and 5 specifically how to use our action in a way that reduces these vasanas, because that's what agitates my mind. And so the first principle of karma yoga, act. Here the metaphor that Vyasa uses in Bhagwad Gita is fight, because that's Arjuna. But for you and me, it means act. How? According to your vasanas, you can do no other. If you don't like the vasanas you have and you try to do something else, they don't go away. You just get a new set of vasanas. There's more stuff you got to deal with. So how? First principle, act. How? According to your vasanas. The word we use for this is swadharma. Swa means self. Dharma here means the law of our being, our nature. So the deep essence of us, the dharma of the self, is God consciousness. But at the level of the equipment, each one of us is unique. Each one of us has an individually unique set of proclivities. what you are here to do is different than the next person. So Fang, you can't want to be Deepa. She's taken. Mark, you can't want to be Fang. She's taken. You can only be yourself. So this is an exercise in authenticity. In English, in many spiritual traditions, we have words like vocation. Comes from the Latin vocare, to call. A calling. In Sanskrit, we call it swadharma. Now, the exoteric understanding of this, according to the four varnas, the four castes, if you're a Brahmin, you're supposed to be a scholar and study, do spiritual things, be an educator, etc. If you're Kshatriya, you're supposed to be a warrior, you're supposed to be a king or a general or maybe an attorney. If you're a Vaishya, you're supposed to be a merchant. If you're a Shudra, you're supposed to be a laborer. That's an exoteric understanding of Swadharma. The esoteric understanding of it, especially in our modern world, where we have vocational and social mobility. What do you want to do with your life? Joseph Campbell used to call it follow your bliss. Getting in touch with what is it that I feel I'm here to do. It's not about a having or an endpoint. It's the action itself that I love. Work is the highest form of play. Play is the highest form of work. So if you're working at something and it's drudgery and soul crushing for you, what I say, take a look. Are you acting according to your swadharma? Or are you stuck acting from what the psychologists call super ego? The wagging finger of parents. This is what you should do. You need to make a lot of money so you can take care of your parents in their old age. Or our kind of people only do these kinds of things. Or other societal pressures. Oh, we're an immigrant family. We were very poor. You've got to make money, you know, those unconscious drives. Or you're caught up in status. All my friends own their own businesses. Maybe I should start a business. These sorts of pressures are not about swadharma. That's defining from the outside. If you were independently wealthy, had all the education in the world, all the contacts in the world, what would you be doing with your life? And if your first answer is, I'd be cruising around the Caribbean on a ship, that gets very boring after 2-3 weeks. We are built to work. We are built to serve. Now, here, Krishna is saying to Arjuna, he knows Arjuna is a Kshatriya. So his swadharma is he loves a good fight. We know people like that. Do you have friends who, no matter what you say to them, they argue just for the sake of argument? They love it. You think, oh my God, they should become an attorney. They're Kshatriyas, or people who just have to get involved in social activism. They can't stand to see injustice in the world. Doesn't matter what kind of family they came from. If that's the driving impulses of their lives, they're Kshatriyas. So they should follow that. So there's nothing more fun for Kshatriya than a noble fight. So Krishna is saying to Arjuna, you shouldn't grieve for this reason, you shouldn't grieve for this one, you shouldn't grieve for that person. Now, remember way back in the end of the first chapter, Arjuna sits down on the bottom of the chariot and says, I will not fight. Krishna, knowing his self-nature, knowing his Swadharma, says, dude, you can go off to the forest and try to be a yogi and a meditator. It ain't going to work. Because your Swadharma, your nature is to fight. Now, listen very carefully. Shrunahu. What we do in life has little to do with self-realization. One of our most famous scriptures is Yoga Vasishta. One of my favorite stories is about a demoness named Karpati. She's big and she's fat. She can't get enough people to eat. That's her food. So she meditates and through tapas transforms herself into Suchi, which is a needle. She becomes the disease cholera. And for thousands of years, she's able to eat millions of people. Still doesn't satisfy her. So she begins self-inquiry and she becomes enlightened. And she comes out of samadhi and says, I don't want to do bad things, but I'm Kshatriya. Human flesh is my food. I'll only eat bad, stupid people. She's in the forest. This king and this minister comes through and she goes, Rawr! I'm going to give you 3 riddles. If you answer them, on your way. If you don't answer them, I'm going to eat you. So, of course, she asks questions about the nature of ultimate reality. Well, the king happens to be a realized soul. He answers all the questions. And she says, can't eat you. You're a wise man. And he says, not only that, you should stop eating people. It's not nice. And she says, all right, because she's a renunciate. But if I don't eat people, I will waste away and die. I'm fine with that. And the king goes, that's not going to work. Okay, you come up to my kingdom in the Himalayas. And for most of the year, you run around in the court as a beautiful lady. Then once a year, you go back into your form as a demoness, and all the criminals who have capital punishment sentences, you eat them. So that's what she does. The import of the story, there are many, but one of them is she never leaves her Swadharma. She never stops being a flesh-eating demoness. And we have all sorts of other stories. King Janaka, when he attains self-realization, he does not become a sannyasi and go off to the forest. He's a king. He stays a king. Antithetically, we have those whose Swadharma is to be renunciants. My grandfather guru, Swami Chinmayananda's guru, Swami Tapovana, lived in a little mud hut in Uttarkashi. Didn't even own a pair of chappals, sandals. Wandered in the Himalayas. There's a wonderful story that he was wandering along the road and a bunch of robbers came and they were going to rob him. And he said, well, I have my kurta and I have my begging bowl. You're welcome to them. And they, oh, we have nothing. We don't need any of that. And then Tapovanam said, well, I'm hungry. Do you guys have any food? Oh, yeah. So he sat down and ate with the robbers. The outside is not what determines it. It's an inside job. So we need to identify what our swadharma is and act accordingly. Now, I'm going to briefly share the other 3 dimensions of karma yoga, and we will cover them later. First one, act vigorously. How? According to your swadharma. In the yajna spirit, meaning we do selfless service with it. Dedicate your activity to something greater than your own ego needs. Renouncing our attachment to the fruits of action, the karma phalam. And the last one, renouncing our identification with the sense of agency. That's the most subtle. We'll cover that more deeply in chapter 5. So all of this is wrapped up in this verse we've just covered. The whole teaching of karma yoga. So Krishna here identifies in Arjuna that he's Kshatriya. And he says, and go fight this war because you're gonna have a blast. It's just what you're designed to do. We're built to work, which is different than struggling. When we're against our swadharma, our work becomes laborious and effortful and soul-crushing. Work is the highest form of play. Play is the highest form of work. Do what you love. And if you're not yet doing what you love, you start by learning to love what you do. That will move you. Any questions about this? All right, Deepa, next verse.
Just a second, let me bring up the presentation. Atha chettvamimam dharmyam samgramam na karishyasi tatha swadharmam kirtitam tatha swadharmam kirtim cha hitva papamavapyasi. But if you will not fight this righteous war, then having abandoned your own duty and fame, you shall incur sin.
Okay, and he when he says duty here, the word he's using is swadharma. So if you don't fight the war, you will be abandoning the law of your own nature, and you will incur sin. And the word here is papam in Sanskrit. We talk about papam, sin, punya, merit. Now we want to take the juridical approach to sin and merit out of this. That in many ways is a Judeo-Christian overlay on what it is. We also want to let go of the Vedic ritual understanding. where papam is ritual impurity. So that if you've done something that makes you ritually impure, you have to go bathe and do mantras before you can go to the temple, etc. We don't want to talk about it from that standpoint. Here is the definition of punya and papam that works for yogis. Any activity, gross or subtle, gross meaning it's a physical activity, subtle meaning it's a way of thinking, that is conducive to quiescence of mind is punya. Any activity, gross or subtle, that grossifies the mind, makes it thicker and denser, agitates the mind, is papam. Any activity, gross or subtle, that's conducive to quiescence is punya. Any activity, gross or subtle, that's conducive to agitation or grossification of the mind is papam. With that in mind, you don't need a rule book. You just need to pay attention to your mind. It will tell you. Doing God's will, doing punya. How do I know I'm doing it? It brings peace. Now, it can shift. Let me give you a very worldly example. So, for example, if someone is an alcoholic and they go into treatment and they come out and they've given up drugs and alcohol, but they smoke. Well, their sponsor, their mentor may say, don't worry about the smoking. You just concentrate on don't drink, don't use drugs. Okay. So when they're agitated and they want to drink or they want to do drugs, they may eat some candy or they may have a cigarette. But then a year later, they may be going, God, I've got to quit smoking. It's just, or they say, oh my God, I've put on 40 pounds eating ice cream. I need to change my diet. Then it's time to shift. So what may be punya at one point in our life can become papam later as we evolve spiritually. Now, listen very carefully. This principle is also true about meditation. Oh, Jim, should I chant a mantra? That's a very good thing. Japa is the king of yogas. We'll hear that in Gita. But if your mind gets quieter than the mantra, drop the mantra. Be in the silence. If your mind is too gross to just do japa, a silent repetition of a mantra, you may want to chant the name of the Lord out loud or put on a bhajan on YouTube and sing along with it. If your mind is tamasic and very gross and heavy, what you may want to do is some retail therapy. Well, I thought we weren't supposed to be engaged in satisfying material senses. No, nobody said that. But if your mind is moving from rajas, an active mind, into sattva, you may want to simplify your life. So the activity isn't inherently punya or papa. All depends on how gross or subtle your equipment is. By equipment, I mean the body, mind, intellect. It's relative and it can shift. Any questions about this? So, what Krishna is saying is if you don't fight and instead go to some hermitage and try to be a yogi at this stage of your evolution, you will become grosser. In other words, you're going to be thinking about the war you're not fighting. They don't go away. They don't go away. We have to deal with these proclivities, these vasanas. And you're going to create more stuff. Real live example. Years ago, I had a meditation center in San Francisco on Market Street. Mark, is that where you first showed up? Was it at the Silent Way Center on Market Street?
Yeah, it was. I saw your advertisement in the BAR.
Yeah. Well, we used to have evening meditation. I can't even remember what time. It was like 6 or 6:30. Every day we used to have it. And there was this fellow who showed up and he sat in meditation. And I think it was like 40 minutes or something like that. It's been so long, I can't remember. And afterward, he was sharing that 20 years earlier, he had been associated with this fellow, they called him Guru Maharaji, who was a 14-year-old guru who came to the States, tried to live in an ashram in Florida where you had to practice brahmacharya, meaning being celibate. He was not at a stage in his life to do that. So all the time, every day, when he was in the ashram, all he was thinking about was the sex he wasn't having. He comes to our meditation center 20 years later. And he's in meditation. He comes out and he starts to share. All he could think about is the sex he didn't have 20 years ago. His mind got stuck there because he was practicing suppression. He was pressing down his desires. Never works. Swamiji used to say, if you do it too much, you will bend and warp the mind to the point where it's incapable of doing yoga. We have to deal with the material that we have. Act according to your swadharma, in the yajna spirit, renouncing your attachment to the fruits of action and your identification with the sense of agency. So here Krishna says, if you don't fight, it's going to give you problems psychologically. Next one.
Verse 34. Akirti chapi bhutani kathayishyanti te vyayam Sambhavitasya cha kirtir marana datirichyate. People too will recount your everlasting dishonor, and to the one who has been honored, dishonor is more than death.
So here Krishna keeps poking at it. So for Kshatriya, the payoff for winning the war, one of his great motivators is honor. Many people, this is a very, very important motivator in their lives. They want to be seen as a noble, honest, honorable person. This is not a negative thing. For example, if you're, let's say, accused of something at work that you didn't do, accused of stealing somebody else's work, or accused of having made a mistake that you didn't do, most of us would react strongly. No, that's dishonorable. I don't want to be dishonored. I'm a person of integrity. I don't lie, cheat, and steal. Don't say that about me. So here, Krishna, knowing that honor is very important to Kshatriya, and most specifically to General Arjuna, he says, if you don't fight this war, people are going to say, he backed out. He's a loser. Suckers and losers. That's what they're going to call you. Sucker and a loser. Couldn't fight. Has no courage. Coward. Ran from the battlefield. Now, for a person like Arjuna, that would be a fate worse than death. To be seen that way. So Krishna knows where his buttons are. Now we all have them. Ours may not be so concerned about what other people think of us. But you know where your buttons are. Where do I get agitated? It can be something as simple as I'm hypersensitive to criticism. Not a whole lot different. Same idea. All right, next one.
Can I ask a question, Jim?
Please do.
Isn't the desire for honor or aversion to dishonor in itself a vasana?
Absolutely. But again, you don't get rid of the desire like flipping off a light switch. You've got to work with what you have. I was talking with a young man this morning, and he's wanting to go into venture capital. He really does want to be financially successful. He's ambitious. He wants to make a lot of money. What I applaud is that he's willing to admit that about himself. Now, he should do it as karma yoga. But you don't want to wimp out on that. Other people I know, like myself, I could give it, money has never been an attractive thing to me. It's not unattractive. I need enough to get by in life. But I've never had the desire to be a successful or wealthy person. Or if someone decides to start a business, they better be ambitious because it's hard work. So there's nothing wrong with ambition. Oh, by the way, the desire to be a good yogi is a desire. All action under all circumstances has desire as its impulse. It's the great engine of the human psyche. So we can't, okay, here's a very old story that Ram Dass used to tell. Once upon a time, there was a man in a village, and he was a farmer. And of course, in the villages in India, out in the rural areas, back in olden times, you used to fertilize the fields with night soil, with human waste. Well, this particular farmer just did not want to deal with his own shit. So when planting season came, he went to the village down the road and bought somebody else's shit to put on his fields. And frequently, that's what we do. We're unwilling to deal with our own issues and go looking for somebody else's or something else's to do. So whatever is the driving passion of your life, you need to cop to it. That's your swadharma. Do something. Serve the society. I don't know if that was helpful. Was it?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, it was.
Yes. Now, I was talking with a young lady, and she's been involved in the business world, and she was talking about perhaps wanting to go study philosophy and theology and stuff like that. And I suggested that she might consider going to Kerala, to the Chinmaya International Foundation for a year and study the Vedanta course there. And then I think when she really looked at the possibility, at least today, well, actually, no, that's not what I really want to do. And that can happen to us too. We may think we want this, but then we actually confronted with it. No, I don't really want to do that. Remember, the dharma of the body is karma. You cannot escape action. And for most of us, unless we're trust fund kids, in the end, we have to support ourselves. No one gets away without working. And many trust fund kids are the most miserable because they have no purpose in life other than just gratifying their desires, their ego needs and stuff like that. They become horribly self-indulgent. As I said earlier, what we do in the world in and of itself is in another realm than the spiritual life. You got to do something. You got to do something. All of the rishis who wrote the Upanishads were householders, which means they had to support a family in some way, shape, or form. They may have been scholars. They may have taught Sanskrit. They may have been scribes. They may have been advisors at court. Do you know who Vidyaranya was back in the 14th century? He was Shankaracharya of, I think, the Sringeri Mutt, wrote the book Panchadashi. He was deeply involved in politics. Was basically ruling one of the smaller states at one point. Gotta do something according to your swadharma. And this is a great misunderstanding about the spiritual life. People who think it's spiritual to reject the world. No, we got to see the world for what it is. In the end, the world is Brahman. Sarvam kalvidam Brahma. All this is verily Brahman. Now, it may be your swadharma to be an ascetic. But that's not for everyone. You'll know. All right, next one,
Jim, can I ask a question?
please.
Hi, this is Vikas. Is it possible to tell the difference between repression and punya, the way you described it? Can punya mask itself as repression?
You'll know whether or not it's repression because you'll get depressed. If you feel shut down and your life starts to taste like ashes, you're probably repressing.
Okay.
Did that make sense?
It makes sense, but I'm not sure if it's easy to tell the difference.
Well, you have to be very observant, because if you, for example, give up a bad habit, the mind will grieve for a while. I'm thinking of a friend who, in her mid-20s, finally found out that she has celiac disease. She's very allergic to gluten, and she's Indian, which is unusual. Most South Asians, it's very rare among South Asians to have celiac disease. It's far more common among Europeans. And there may have been, a missionary in the woodpile. I don't know. But the point is, when she finally found out that that's what was making her so ill, she had to give up gluten. And she really liked her sweets and her pastries and things like that. And it was hard giving that stuff up. But once she had the insight, if I eat the chocolate cake, I'm going to have a bellyache. Chocolate cake equals bellyache. And after a while, even though she'd see the chocolate cake and go, oh, that looks so good, she could think it through. And then 20 minutes later, the desire always goes away. They never last. And then the mind goes, oh, I'm so glad I didn't eat that chocolate cake. I feel good. So that's not repression, that's insight. Do you see the difference?
Yeah.
But if you see the chocolate cake and say, I'm not going to eat chocolate cake because I'm a yogi and I want to give myself a gold star for what a renunciate I am. Can everybody see what a pruny face I have because I don't do anything I enjoy? And I'm an old man, I'm 72. And I've met lots of people in the spiritual life, both East and West. And if you look at old swamis, old monks and nuns, when they get old, they almost always separate themselves into two categories. There are those who are filled with joy, and they're just luminous and glowing because they feel so full of God power. And then there are those who are bitter and angry and annoyed at everything because they've lived lives of repression, not real renunciation. It catches up with them. And that's a wasted life in some ways. If this is difficult to internalize today, don't worry about it. Just put it on the shelf, because we're going to go into all these ideas really deeply when we study chapters 3, 4, and 5.
Okay, thank you.
Can I dovetail on that question, Jim?
Please.
Sorry, my cat also. Meow. Sorry. When it comes to gluten and chocolate cake, I think the insights are obvious. But when you have competing proclivities to say join a nonprofit versus make and work on your ambition in a tech job, making that choice often does not have clear insight that lives in a textbook or a doctor's office. And making the choice based on what a class recommends that is the higher choice is still, to me, like operating from superego.
I think you're right. What I always invite people to do, it's a question I ask frequently. If you were independently wealthy, had all the education in the world, all the talent in the world, and connections, which of those two jobs would you be doing?
Mm.
What's the answer?
Mm.
And what those do is they get rid of all the fear of financial insecurity, the idea that ambition means make a lot of money. What it does is it puts you in touch with what you really want. Now, frequently I will meet people who think they need to make the money so they can do what they really want at a later point. And the problem we have with that is the end is the means in a different form. So, for example, if you go into tech and you work for 20 years so you can make enough money to be in the nonprofit sector, at the end of a period of time, you will become a very good person in tech because the end is the means in a different form. And you will have no skills in the nonprofit sector because you haven't been doing it. But if you have the courage to say, God is my supply, God will take care of me, God's my real employer, I'm going to do what I feel called to do. You go into the nonprofit sector, and you may not make enough money right away. Or you may learn to live on much less and be satisfied because what you're doing is so rewarding. But what you learn to do is trust and not live out of fear of insecurity. Did that make sense?
Yes, thank you, Jim.
Let me give you a real live example. Now, I live on about $40,000 a year. In the Bay Area, most of the people I know pay more in taxes than I make in income. I have no debts. I eat really well. I have a beautiful apartment. But I live pretty simply because I'm doing what I love and I don't have needs to fix my discontent with buying bling. I have friends who make 6 figures and are tens of thousands of dollars in debt because they compulsively spend. They're agitated and they think a cashmere sweater is going to fix it. Or the Honda isn't good enough, I have to drive a BMW. You know, they have all these ideas that more and fancier stuff will do it. And if you're always spending more than you're making, you're always going to have fear. Basic law of money. If you spend more than you make, you're in deep shit. Period. Duh. Be surprised how many people don't get that. If you spend less than you make, money works for you. So simple. But ambition has very little to do with income. Ambition has to do with being able to play at a higher level. So, for example, when I got my church job, one of the things I loved when they gave me a bigger and bigger budget is I could hire musicians at a very high level. Made some fabulous music because I could play at a higher level. So money's just energy. All it is. Money's just stored energy. There's a big distinction between simplicity and poverty. Poverty is when I don't have enough. Now, you could be poor on the street, etc. Or you could run around with an impoverished viewpoint, meaning there's never enough. There's never enough. I'm greedy, greedy, greedy. There's never enough. And that person is just as miserable as the person on the street. Simplicity means I have contentment. I'm satisfied with what is. I have more than enough. I can give things away. I have a generous life. All right, we've gone over it. These are great questions. And again, we will go into these in much greater depth in 3, 4, and 5. We just touch the surface of them here in the second chapter. Any other questions? We have another about 5 minutes of questions. Yes? No?
Well, not a question, but maybe I'd like you to comment on this,
Sure.
shed some light on it. What would be the negative aspects of the power of positive thinking?
Excellent question. The power of positive thinking is real. And all these Western teachings that teach it, many of them actually trace their roots back to India. There was a fellow in the middle of the 19th century by the name of Thomas Troward, who was a British judge in the Punjab. And he was one of the first Westerners to study with a yogi. We do not know with whom he studied, but obviously it was a tantrika. And he began to go back to Britain and write, and his books are dull as bat poop. His most famous is called The Creative Process in the Individual, and then he has a series called the Edinburgh Lectures on Mental Science. And what he basically taught was the law of sankalpa, but he put it into understandable European English. The law of sankalpa is any sankalpa, that's a hard word to translate, wish, will, intention, thought, that is consistently maintained, that's not conflicted or contradicted, tends towards grossification. The Westerners would say manifestation. So all these prosperity gospels and teaching like that, power of positive thinking, many of them trace their roots back through Troward to India. And the idea is the Vedantan sees this world as a dream. Why should I get involved? Just watch the movie. It's all going to work out. None of it touches me. The Tantrika has the same insight, but has the additional inspiration, desire. Well, it may be a dream, but it doesn't have to be a nightmare. Now, where the power of positive thinking as it's come into the Western world begins to be problematic. If I want a Cadillac, yes, I can do visualizations of a Cadillac. I now affirm I have a Cadillac right now. I see the Cadillac in my driveway. It's a big black sedan and it has beautiful black leather interior. I do my visualization, do that every day. That very likely will move you towards manifesting a Cadillac. But what that whole process doesn't deal with is the underlying sankalpa of spiritual ignorance, which is getting what I want will make me happy. Now, probably the best known and best organized tantric tradition in the world right now is Tibetan Buddhism. And they do these beautiful sand paintings and they chant and stuff like that. And they do tantric practices for the healing and the benefit of the entire world. But whatever puja they do, whatever yantras they do, always begin and end with a meditation on shunyata. Shunyata means emptiness or voidness. So you want to start your power of positive thinking with this affirmation, this insight. It's all Brahman. It's all God. The self is everywhere and everything. I need nothing to make me happy. Chidananda Rupaham. My self nature is bliss consciousness. Now, from that understanding, if the desire is about expression, service, creativity, fun, go for it. But if your underlying unconscious sankalpa is, I need, I must have, if I don't have this, I won't be happy. Gimme, 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 gimme. You may get the object, but you've not dealt with the sankalpa. I don't have enough. Did that make sense?
Yes, Jim, thank you.
So it does work. It does work. There are some sankalpas we cannot overcome. I had a fellow come sit with me and he was reading this book about yogis in the Himalayas who lived 400 years. So I said, well, what happens at 401? They're dead. Because the Lord's sankalpa is nobody gets out alive. Everybody dies, whether it's at 30, 40, 90, or 400. You're going to die. That's the Lord's sankalpa. I don't care what people do in the science lab, they cannot make light go any faster than 186,000 miles per second. Nobody's been able to get light to go 187,000 miles per second. That's the Lord's sankalpa. So we have limited freedom to reenact the creative process in the individual. And this is the whole art and science of Tantra. It's the wielding of energy. And it's rooted in the idea that this entire universe is like a dream. It's just vibration held together by thought. And so is my life, so is your life. And we have far more power to shift and change it than we think. All right, I've gone on too long. Let's sit. Om Namah Shivaya.